He thought humiliating her in front of the entire room would be an easy victory, but he had no idea he had just scheduled the collapse of his own reputation. The grand hall of Hawthorne Institute glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors, where the city's most influential donors, professors, and trustees gathered in tailored suits and careful smiles. It was the kind of room where status entered before people did, where names mattered more than character, and where silence itself seemed expensive. At precisely 7 p.m., Dean Victor Langley stepped onto the stage, adjusting the cuff of his navy jacket as applause rolled toward him like a practiced wave. At 58, Victor carried authority the way some men carried cologne, too strongly and impossible to ignore. He was admired, feared, and privately resented, which suited him just fine. Tonight's gala was meant to celebrate excellence, and in Victor's mind, excellence had always looked remarkably similar to himself. Near the rear entrance, unnoticed by nearly everyone, Claire Whitman placed a tray of water glasses on a linen-covered table. She wore a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, practical shoes, and the calm expression of someone who had long ago stopped expecting fairness from rooms like this. At 39, Claire moved quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. To the guests, she was another support employee helping the evening run smoothly. To Victor, she was less than that. He noticed her only when she crossed a line he had invented. "You there," he called from the stage steps, his microphone still live enough to carry across the hall. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Claire stopped, one hand still resting on the silver tray. "The table cards belong on the east side, not there," Victor said, smiling the smile of a man who enjoyed correction more than kindness. Attention to detail is the foundation of competence. A few people chuckled softly, eager to agree with power. Claire glanced at the cards, then at the marked floor plan nearby. She knew they were exactly where the event coordinator had requested. "I was following the revised placement list, sir," she said gently. Victor descended one step, amused now. "Were you?" "That would be impressive, considering those revisions were sent only to senior staff." More laughter. Claire felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from the exhausting predictability of arrogance. She could have answered. She could have explained that the coordinator had handed her the list personally after 3 others misplaced it. She could have pointed out that she had corrected half the evening scheduling mistakes before guests arrived. Instead, she simply lowered her eyes for a moment and moved the cards. The room relaxed. Order had been restored. Or so they thought. Victor returned to center stage and launched into his opening remarks about merit, discipline, and standards. He spoke with polished certainty, pausing often enough for applause. Every phrase was designed to sound noble while reminding listeners who stood above them. Claire continued working along the walls, refilling glasses, adjusting place settings, listening without appearing to listen. She had heard versions of this speech her whole life from men who confused volume with wisdom. At table 12, 2 younger board members watched her pass. "Langley really enjoys that," one whispered. "He enjoys audiences," the other replied. Across the room, Professor Eleanor Price, a visiting scholar from Boston, observed Claire more carefully than the others. She noticed the woman's posture, steady and unhurried. She noticed the way Claire's eyes briefly settled on the equations displayed in the decorative slideshow behind the stage, a rotating tribute to the Institute's research achievements. Most people ignored those symbols. Claire studied them for half a second, then moved on. Eleanor narrowed her eyes with interest. On stage, Victor raised a crystal glass. "Tonight," he declared, "we honor intellect, the force that separates aspiration from achievement." The audience applauded again. Then the projector flickered. A new slide appeared unexpectedly, showing a complex mathematical model scheduled for the Institute's private research presentation later that night. Victor froze for only a breath before masking it with a smile. "Ah," he said smoothly, "a preview of work too advanced for casual discussion." Several guests laughed appreciatively. Claire, now near the center aisle, looked up once more. Her expression changed so slightly almost no one noticed. Almost. Eleanor Price did. Victor saw it too, and something in that quiet glance irritated him more than open defiance ever could. It was not admiration. It was recognition. He set down his glass slowly. "Perhaps," he said, voice sharpening with inspiration cruel men often mistake for brilliance, "we might have a little demonstration tonight." He looked directly at Claire. "You seem interested, miss." The hall grew still. Claire met his gaze for the first time. "Whitman," she answered. Victor smiled wider. "Miss Whitman. Then don't hide in the background. Come join us." The room went silent. Claire did not move immediately. The tray remained balanced in her hands, the glasses barely trembling despite the 100 eyes now fixed on her. Some faces carried amusement, others curiosity, and a few the quiet discomfort of people who recognized cruelty but lacked the courage to interrupt it. Dean Victor Langley waited beside the stage stairs with the patience of a man certain the room belonged to him. "Come now," he said, voice warm enough to sound generous and sharp enough to cut beneath it. "Surely we can spare our staff for a moment of educational entertainment." A ripple of laughter traveled through the ballroom. Claire set the tray down carefully on the nearest table. The small sound of crystal touching linen seemed louder than it should have. Then she walked forward. No hurry. No hesitation. Just steady steps across polished marble that reflected the chandelier light like still water. Victor studied her as she approached, expecting embarrassment, perhaps refusal, perhaps tears. He understood those reactions well because he had caused them often. What he did not understand was composure. Claire stopped 3 feet away. "You wanted something, sir?" she asked. The directness of the question drew a few raised brows. Victor smiled wider. "Only participation, Miss Whitman. Since you seemed interested in the model. Behind me, perhaps you would care to explain it to our guests." Several trustees exchanged amused glances. A donor in a velvet jacket leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her grin behind her glass. Victor gestured to the giant screen where lines of symbols, matrices, and variables glowed in elegant blue. "Do not worry," he added loudly. "We are all friends here." Even those who laughed knew that was not true. Claire turned to the screen. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes moved once from left to right, then back to the center. Professor Eleanor Price, seated near the front, straightened in her chair. She had spent 20 years in applied mathematics and recognized the expression immediately. It was not confusion. It was evaluation. Victor mistook the silence for surrender. "If this is beyond your experience," he said, "there is no shame in admitting it. Excellence requires preparation." Claire looked back at him. "This version does," she said calmly. The room quieted by instinct. Victor blinked. "I beg your pardon." "This version requires preparation," Claire repeated. "Because line 4 invalidates the assumptions made in line 2. The stability term should collapse after 48 hours, maybe sooner depending on load conditions." No one laughed now. Victor's smile held, but only by force. "That is a remarkable statement," he said. "From event staff." Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her. "It is a remarkable mistake," she replied. A murmur rolled through the tables. Eleanor Price lowered her glass and stared openly at the stage. Victor's jaw tightened. "You are guessing," he said. "Actually," Claire answered, "I am being polite." Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped the floor. A trustee coughed into his napkin to hide a laugh that arrived too late. Victor stepped closer to the screen, scanning the equations as if they might defend him. "This model was reviewed by senior researchers," he said. "Then they were in a hurry," Claire said. The words were soft, almost kind, which made them land harder. The ballroom had changed. A few minutes earlier it was his audience. Now it was a jury. Victor turned toward the technician. "Booth. Bring me a marker," he ordered. Then he faced Claire again. "If you believe you can do better, Miss Whitman, by all means enlighten us." Claire glanced at the marker, then at the white presentation board wheeled beside the podium. "I can," she said. "But first, someone should tell your donors what they almost funded." The room went silent again. No one moved. Even the waitstaff near the service doors stood perfectly still, trays suspended midair as if the entire ballroom had forgotten how motion worked. Dean Victor Langley accepted the marker from a nervous technician and handed it to Claire with theatrical courtesy. "Please," he said, stepping aside. "We are eager to learn." The room heard the words. It also heard the strain beneath them. Claire took the marker and walked to the white board beside the podium. Her cardigan sleeve brushed the polished frame as she uncapped it. Then, without glancing back at the giant screen, she began writing. Her hand moved quickly, cleanly, with the confidence of someone not solving a puzzle but correcting a typo. Symbols appeared in sharp black lines. Terms were reorganized. Assumptions rewritten. A missing constraint added near the top. At table 7, a venture capitalist quietly lowered his phone and started paying attention for the first time all evening. Victor folded his arms. "Interesting handwriting," he said. "But equations are not decoration." Claire continued writing. "Good," she replied. "Then perhaps they will finally be judged by substance tonight." A few guests laughed before catching themselves. Victor's face hardened. Professor Eleanor Price rose from her chair and moved closer to the stage, unable to remain seated. She watched Claire's structure take shape and felt the unmistakable jolt of professional recognition. This was not memorized knowledge. This was mastery. Claire drew a final line beneath the revised model and stepped back. "Your original design amplifies instability whenever demand spikes above projected thresholds," she said, speaking to the room rather than to Victor. "That means emergency expansion would create cascading failure. In plain language, the more success you have, the faster it breaks." Murmurs spread across the ballroom. Several donors turned toward one another with alarmed expressions. Victor lifted a hand for silence. "A dramatic theory," he said. "And unsupported." Claire nodded once. "Then test the derivative at the midpoint." Victor did not move. She looked at the board. "Or ask someone qualified." The words landed like polished stone. Eleanor Price stepped fully onto the stage. "I am qualified," she said. Her voice carried the calm authority Victor had always admired when it served him. Tonight it did not. She studied Claire's board for several seconds, then turned to the screen, then back again. The pause felt endless. Finally, Eleanor faced the audience. "She is correct." A sharp intake of breath moved through the hall like wind through trees. "Not partially correct," Eleanor continued. "Completely correct. If this model had proceeded unchanged, it would have failed under moderate scaling." Victor's confidence flickered for the first time. "With respect, Professor Price, you have only reviewed this for a moment." Eleanor met his eyes. "That was all I needed." Somewhere near the rear tables, someone began to clap once, then stopped when no one joined. Claire set the marker down beside the podium. "There is more," she said quietly. Victor turned toward her too quickly. "More?" Claire nodded toward the screen. "The framework is familiar because I published the original version 6 years ago under a joint research consortium. Your team altered the surface language, but not enough to hide the source." Silence became heavier than sound. A trustee whispered, "Published?" Another muttered, "Who is she?" Victor stared as if seeing Claire for the first time and liking none of what he found. "That is impossible," he said. Claire reached into the pocket of her cardigan and removed a worn leather card holder. From it, she slid a folded conference badge onto the podium. Eleanor picked it up, read the name, and slowly looked back at Claire with astonishment. Dr. Claire Whitman, she said. Former lead systems architect, Princeton Applied Futures Lab. The room did not merely go quiet now. It changed sides. The applause did not begin all at once. It started in scattered places, uncertain and sharp, the sound of people realizing too late where respect should have gone. Then it spread across the ballroom in waves until crystal glasses trembled softly on the tables. Dean Victor Langley did not clap. He stood beside the podium with one hand resting on polished wood, his posture still formal but no longer effortless. The room that had once leaned toward him now leaned somewhere else. Claire Whitman remained composed, neither smiling nor seeking vindication. She simply stood where she had been invited as a joke and revealed as truth. Victor cleared his throat and lifted his chin. Well, he said, forcing a light tone that fooled no one, it appears we have all underestimated hidden talent this evening. A few polite laughs answered him, thin and embarrassed. Claire said nothing. Professor Eleanor Price stepped beside the board, still studying the equations. This was not hidden talent, she said without looking up. This was visible talent ignored by people who only recognize titles when printed in gold. Several trustees shifted in their seats. One donor quietly removed his name card from the center table and set it aside, as if distancing himself from the evening itself. Victor's jaw tightened. Dr. Whitman, he said, placing sudden emphasis on the title he had denied her minutes earlier, if you were formerly attached to Princeton Applied Futures Lab, I am sure everyone would appreciate knowing why someone with your credentials is arranging table cards at a gala. The question was framed as curiosity but delivered as accusation. Claire met his gaze calmly. Because I accepted temporary contract work while consulting remotely, she said. And because honest work does not become smaller when viewed by arrogant people. The room answered with a low murmur of approval. Victor attempted a smile and failed halfway through it. Surely someone of your background could have introduced herself. Claire tilted her head slightly. Surely someone of yours could have introduced himself better. This time the laughter came freely. Victor looked toward the trustees for support and found only lowered eyes. Careful expressions, and one member suddenly fascinated by the dessert menu. Eleanor Price folded her arms. I was invited here to evaluate your innovation initiative, she said. Instead, I watched you publicly demean the most qualified person in the room. Victor straightened. That is an unfair characterization. No, Eleanor replied. It is the gentle version. The word struck harder because they were calm. A silver-haired trustee named Martin Hales slowly rose from table 1. He had funded the institute for 20 years and rarely spoke publicly. When he did, people listened. Dean Langley, he said, voice measured and old enough to carry authority without effort, did your team know this model was derivative work? Victor hesitated 1 second too long. We were in active development, he said. That is not what I asked, Martin replied. Silence settled again. Victor glanced toward his research director, but the man stared firmly at his own shoes. Claire reached into her cardigan pocket and placed a thin folder on the podium. Original publication dates, conference records, and licensing terms, she said. I brought them because I recognized the screensaver during setup. Several people laughed softly at the phrase screensaver. Martin accepted the folder, scanned the top page, then looked at Victor with visible disappointment. You used tonight to seek funding for borrowed work, he said. And insulted the person who created it while she served your guests water. No one rushed to defend him. Victor's shoulders remained square, but something essential had left his posture. Claire picked up the tray she had set down earlier. If there is nothing else, she said, table 12 requested sparkling water. She turned to leave. Half the room stood before she reached the stairs. Claire had nearly reached table 12 when Martin Hales spoke again. Dr. Whitman, one moment please. His voice carried the kind of authority that never needed volume. The ballroom remained standing in uneven clusters, guests turning to follow her path as though afraid to miss the final lesson of the evening. Claire paused, tray in hand, then turned with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. Martin descended from the front table slowly, silver cuff links catching the chandelier light. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for my words, because I offered none, but for my silence while others misused theirs." The room listened carefully. Claire set the tray down on a nearby table. "Silence can be expensive," she replied. "Especially when paid for by comfort." A few heads lowered at that. Martin nodded once, accepting the truth without defense. "Then allow me to spend differently now." He turned toward the trustees. "Effective immediately, all funding discussions for tonight's initiative are suspended pending review." A collective stir moved through the donors. Victor Langley stepped forward at last, color returning to his face in flashes of controlled anger. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can clarify every concern privately." Martin looked at him for a long second. "Private is where many problems survive," he answered. Tonight they became public. Victor's reply never came. Across the room, several board members were already conferring in hushed tones, not around him but away from him. Eleanor Price approached Claire with a business card held between two fingers. "I came here to evaluate programs," she said. "Instead I found the person who should be leading one. If you are willing, I would like to discuss a fellowship and a research chair." Claire glanced at the card but did not take it immediately. "That is generous," she said. "But I have current obligations." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Temporary contract work." Claire's eyes warmed for the first time that evening. "Community math labs," she said. 3 nights a week. Public libraries. Students who cannot afford tutors. The nearest guests fell quiet again, but this silence was different. It carried respect rather than tension. "Then perhaps," Eleanor said, "we build something around that instead." Martin turned back toward the audience. "Anyone interested in real innovation," he said, "may speak with Dr. Whitman after dinner, if she chooses." Hands that had eagerly applauded Victor an hour earlier now rose toward Claire with invitations, cards, promises, and sudden admiration. She looked at them all, then gently shook her head. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I am working." Even the waitstaff smiled. Victor stood alone near the podium, abandoned by momentum, betrayed by the room he once controlled. He adjusted his cuff out of habit, then realized no one was watching. Claire lifted the tray once more and resumed walking to table 12. "Sparkling water?" she asked the startled couple seated there. "Yes," the man said quickly, standing as she poured. "Thank you, Dr. Whitman." She gave a small nod. "Claire is fine." Throughout dessert service, guests spoke more softly than before. Titles seemed less useful now. Expensive laughter sounded thinner. Several donors approached junior staff members with sudden courtesy, as if manners could be retroactive. When the evening ended, Claire tied off a trash bag, stacked in used linens, and signed her temporary shift sheet beside the kitchen door. Eleanor waited nearby. "You could leave all this behind tomorrow," she said. Claire slipped on her coat. "I already did," she answered, glancing toward the ballroom where Victor remained in tense discussion with trustees. "Some people need a room full of strangers to feel important. I only needed work worth doing." She stepped into the cold night air beneath the city lights and walked toward a modest sedan parked 2 blocks away. Behind her, inside the grand hall, everyone remembered exactly what dignity looked like. The next morning, snow-colored light spilled across the windows of Westbridge Public Library as Claire Whitman arranged folding chairs in a small community room that smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and old carpet. A handwritten sign on the door read "Free Math Workshop, ages 12 to 17. There were no chandeliers here, no marble floors, no donor tables dressed in linen. The room offered scratched desks, mismatched pencils, and a heater that clicked every few minutes like it had opinions. Claire preferred it instantly. By 9 a.m., students began arriving in winter coats and worn sneakers, carrying notebooks held together by rubber bands. Some came eager, some embarrassed, some pretending they had only wandered in by accident. Claire greeted each one the same way, with warmth and no ceremony. Take any seat you like. You are not behind. We start where you are. At 9:12, a shy boy named Marcus admitted he had failed algebra twice. Claire handed him a clean sheet of paper. Then today you have 2 years of experience learning what does not work, she said. That is useful. The room laughed softly, including Marcus. Tension dissolved. She moved from table to table with the patience of someone who understood that confusion was rarely about numbers and often about fear. Across town, the morning papers had already begun carrying stories about the previous night. Phones buzzed in offices. Trustees drafted statements. Donors requested meetings. Dean Victor Langley, who once controlled the tone of every room he entered, now sat in a glass office watching silence ignore him. But none of that entered the library. Claire had switched her phone off before sunrise. At 10:30, the door opened again. Professor Eleanor Price stepped inside wearing a camel coat and carrying a cardboard tray of hot chocolate. She paused, taking in the scene, Claire kneeling beside a table explaining fractions with poker chips, 3 students arguing cheerfully over geometry, 1 girl smiling for perhaps the first time all week. I brought reinforcements, Eleanor said, lifting the tray. Every teenager in the room looked up immediately. Claire smiled. Then you already understand motivation. Eleanor distributed cups and stood near the wall, watching the workshop continue. You could be leading a national institute, she said quietly when Claire joined her for a moment. Instead you are here teaching percentages with snack food. Claire glanced toward Marcus, who was now solving equations with growing confidence. One of those changes headlines, she said. The other changes lives. Eleanor had no reply ready for that. At noon, a black sedan stopped outside the library. Martin Hales stepped out, carrying 2 banker boxes. He entered awkwardly, clearly unfamiliar with places that did not valet park. I hope I am not interrupting, he said. Claire looked at the boxes. Depends what is inside. Grant. Forms, Martin answered. Scholarship endowments. Equipment requests. Rental budgets. I asked the trustees this morning to redirect last night's suspended funds. The room fell still enough to hear the heater click again. To what? Claire asked. Martin set the boxes on a table. To this. Several students stared as if money itself had walked through the door. Claire looked around the room, at the peeling paint, the crowded desks, the students pretending not to hope too much. Then she looked back at Martin. There will be conditions, she said. Only one, he replied. You run it. Claire considered him for a long moment. No naming rights, she said. No marble plaque. No gala dinner. Martin smiled. Agreed. Marcus raised his hand from the back. Does this mean the heater gets fixed? Laughter filled the room. Martin looked mildly offended. It means we are starting with the heater. Claire turned back to the whiteboard and wrote in large clean numbers, future equals effort plus opportunity. Then she underlined opportunity twice. Outside, the city chased scandal and status. Inside, something far more valuable had quietly begun. Within 3 weeks, the small room at Westbridge Public Library was no longer large enough to hold what had begun there. Folding chairs lined the walls, students shared tables, and late arrivals sat cross-legged on the floor with notebooks balanced on their knees. The heater had been replaced, the lights no longer flickered, and a donated whiteboard stretched across the front wall where peeling paint used to be. Someone had taped a handwritten sign above it that read, "Numbers do not decide your worth." Claire Whitman left it there. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she arrived 10 minutes early carrying a canvas tote filled with markers, worksheets, and granola bars. Every session began the same way. Mistakes are allowed. Questions are welcome. No one gets embarrassed here. Students repeated the phrases with her until they sounded less like rules and more like relief. Marcus, who had once apologized before answering anything, now helped younger students factor polynomials with patient confidence. Lena, a quiet sophomore who believed she was bad at math because one teacher said so in 7th grade, solved geometry proofs faster than anyone in the room. A senior named Javier earned his first A in pre-calculus and stared at the grade for 2 full minutes before believing it belonged to him. News of the program traveled farther than Claire intended. Teachers began recommending students. Parents brought homemade cookies. Retired accountants volunteered on Saturdays. A local hardware store donated calculators. What started as one room quietly became a movement built from pencils, patience, and people finally expecting better. Across town, Hawthorne Institute held a closed board meeting that lasted 4 hours. Dean Victor Langley entered with prepared remarks and left with a cardboard box. No scandalous shouting, no dramatic scene, just signatures, handshakes too brief to be sincere, and the sterile sound of a career being filed away. By afternoon, an interim statement announced leadership restructuring and a renewed commitment to ethical standards. Everyone understood the translation. Victor did not call Claire. Pride often survives longer than power. That evening, as snow tapped softly against the library windows, Eleanor Price arrived carrying rolled blueprints and a grin she did not bother hiding. She spread the plans across a student table. "Unused municipal building 3 blocks east," she said. 8,000 square feet. Classrooms, lab space, accessibility ramps, storage, decent plumbing if we are lucky. The students crowded around as if treasure maps had appeared. Claire folded her arms. "You move quickly." Eleanor shrugged. "I wasted enough years attending dinners." Martin Hales entered moments later with city permits and the expression of a man enjoying usefulness for the first time in decades. "Lease approved," he said. $1 a year. Marcus looked up. "For real?" Martin smiled. "For less than the hot chocolate I bought last week." Laughter filled the room. Claire studied the plans in silence. She could already see it: tutoring rooms, scholarship counseling, coding classes, adult night sessions for parents who never got the chance themselves. Opportunity with walls and working. Heat. "There will be another condition," she said. Martin sighed theatrically. "I was afraid of that." "Students help design it," Claire replied. "They know what they need better than donors do." Martin nodded immediately. "Done." Lena raised her hand from the corner. "Can we paint the walls something brighter than beige?" "Absolutely," Claire said. "Then I vote blue," Marcus added. "Blue feels smart." "Blue feels expensive," Javier said. "Then blue it is," Eleanor replied. As the room laughed again, Claire looked around at faces once marked by hesitation now lit by ownership. No gala had ever looked this successful. She picked up a marker and wrote one new equation on the board: confidence plus access equals momentum. Then she turned back to the students. "All right," she said. "Who wants to help build something bigger than fear?" Every hand went up. By early spring, the old municipal building 3 blocks east no longer looked forgotten. Fresh blue walls replaced tired beige. New lights brightened hallways that had once echoed with emptiness. Classrooms held rows of donated laptops, shelves of textbooks, and bulletin boards crowded with scholarship deadlines, internship flyers, and handwritten notes that read "You belong here." Above the entrance, simple metal letters spelled the Whitman Center for Opportunity, though Claire had argued against using her name until every student voted to keep it. People should know who believed in us first, Marcus told her. She had no answer strong enough to refuse that. Opening day drew more people than anyone expected. Families lined the sidewalk before sunrise. Teachers arrived carrying boxes of supplies. Local reporters stood near the curb hoping for a human interest story and finding something larger. Martin Hales wore work boots instead of dress shoes and looked strangely proud of them. Eleanor Price moved through the lobby directing volunteers with the efficiency of a general who had finally found a cause worth organizing. Claire stood near the front desk in a navy sweater, greeting each student personally. No stage. No spotlight. Just purpose. Inside the largest classroom, Lena helped younger students sign in. Javier tested computers one last time. Marcus adjusted chairs in perfect rows, then changed them into circles because, as he explained, circles felt smarter. At 10 a.m., Martin tapped a spoon against a coffee mug for attention. I was told no speeches, he said. So I will be brief. The room laughed. This building used to store paperwork no one needed. Today it stores potential no one should waste. Applause filled the lobby. Martin turned to Claire. Would you say a few words? She looked around at the crowded room, at students who once avoided eye contact now standing tall enough to lead tours. Yes, she said quietly. But only a few. She stepped forward. The room settled at once. Many people think opportunity arrives as luck, she began. It does not. It is usually built by ordinary people who decide someone else matters. Parents wiped their eyes. Students listened without moving. No one here is behind. No one here is too late. No one here is less because life was expensive. The silence deepened. You do not owe perfection. You owe effort. We will help with the rest. When she finished, applause rose fast and full, but Claire had already stepped aside to let the students take the room back. Across town, Dean Victor Langley sat alone in a corner booth of a quiet hotel cafe, reading an article about the center on his tablet. The headline praised civic partnership, educational access, and a former gala worker whose brilliance changed the city. His name appeared once in paragraph 9. He read that sentence 3 times. Then he set the tablet face down. Some defeats arrive loudly. Others arrive as irrelevance. Back at the center, the first classes began. In one room, 7th graders built bridges from craft sticks and argued over load limits. In another, adults studied for equivalency diplomas after shifts that began before dawn. Eleanor taught advanced statistics to students who had never before met anyone from a world-famous university. Martin assembled desks badly and accepted criticism from teenagers with admirable humility. Claire moved between rooms carrying dry erase markers and answering questions no one else could explain because many were not really about math. How do I apply if my grades were bad? Can I start over at 17? What if I am scared? Her answers were always practical, never dramatic. We fix one thing at a time. Yes. Bring the fear with you and sit down anyway. At sunset, warm light poured through the front windows onto blue walls chosen by students who once believed nothing important would ever ask their opinion. Claire paused in the hallway and listened to the sound of people learning. It was louder than applause and worth far more. 6 months later, the line outside the Whitman Center for Opportunity stretched past the corner bakery and halfway down Maple Street. Parents stood with coffee cups warming their hands. Teenagers compared schedules. Younger children bounced on their heels, eager to follow older siblings into rooms where learning no longer felt like punishment. Inside, every classroom was full. Tutoring lists had wait times. Scholarship advising ran until evening. The coding lab hummed with borrowed ambition becoming real skill. What began as one library workshop had become the kind of place cities often promise and rarely build. Claire Whitman still arrived before sunrise. She unlocked the front doors, turned on hallway lights, and wrote one sentence on the lobby board each morning. Some days it was practical. Ask for help early. Some days it was stern. Excuses are expensive. Some days it was gentle. You are allowed to begin again. Students photographed the board and shared it online. Teachers quoted it in classrooms. Parents repeated it at dinner tables. Claire never signed her name beneath any of it. On a bright Thursday afternoon, Marcus ran into the lobby holding an envelope over his head. State University, he shouted. Full scholarship. The building erupted. Students poured from classrooms cheering as if they had all been admitted with him. Claire hugged him once, quickly, then pointed toward the scholarship office. Now go help the next person fill out forms. Marcus laughed through tears. Yes, ma'am. Claire, she corrected automatically. In room 3, Lena taught geometry to middle school girls who already looked at equations with confidence instead of apology. Javier, now an intern at a software company downtown, returned every Friday to teach coding basics to beginners. Success had become contagious. Martin Hales visited often and no longer wore suits unless forced by funerals or board meetings. He brought donuts, assembled shelves badly, and funded things quietly. Eleanor Price split her time between the center and national conferences where she spoke less about theory and more about access. Talent is common, she told packed auditoriums. Opportunity is not. The quote traveled widely. She always credited Claire. Across town, Victor Langley accepted a consulting role with a private firm whose offices were smaller than the waiting room he once commanded. He was introduced at events as a former administrator, which is another way of saying history. Sometimes he saw headlines about the center. Sometimes he turned the page too quickly. Sometimes he did not. One rainy evening, long after most students had gone home, a teenage girl lingered in the lobby clutching a torn notebook. Claire noticed immediately. You waiting for someone? She asked. The girl shook her head. I almost left 3 times before coming in, she admitted. I am terrible at math. Claire smiled softly. That sentence has wasted years of human potential. She opened the notebook and sat beside her at the front desk. Show me where someone convinced you that was true. The girl hesitated, then turned to page 1. 2 hours later, she walked out smiling with homework completed and shoulders lighter by 20 pounds. After closing, Claire moved through the quiet building turning off lights one room at a time. In the coding lab, screens went dark. In the tutoring wing, whiteboards still carried half-erased formulas. In the lobby, she paused at the message board and wrote tomorrow's sentence in steady blue marker, respect people before they have to prove you wrong. She capped the marker, stepped back, and looked around the building filled with second chances. No chandeliers. No marble floors. No applause. Just lives changing room by room. And that night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, the city slept beneath the work of a woman many once failed to notice.